So I just wanted to take a relatively recent example, the new Marvel's Avengers game from, I believe it's Crystal Dynamics. It's been getting some um, concerned press about how it doesn't feel like you're actually an Avenger, and I want to talk about that in relation to mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. So if you've read the book and you've watched the other video, you know that when we're talking about mechanics and dynamics and aesthetics, what we're talking about here is that mechanics exists in this first box, and then from your mechanics, let me just put the pieces in place. Dynamics, and finally aesthetics. And again, just to go through what Haneke and LeBlanc meant by this, is that developers tend to think about their games from what can we get the player to do, and we're going to spend a little bit of time working in that way because we're learning the skills. So, beginning developers, it's just like, well, what can we actually accomplish? So it's not unreasonable. So the idea at the mechanics side, what can we code so that this is what the player is going to do? The dynamics are the interactions that emerge from those options that are given to the player. And then the result is an experience. So what Haneke and LeBlanc call the aesthetics are not like the sounds and the visuals, but actually the overall gameplay experience that the person has. Now, this article was written early 2000s, maybe even the late 90s. It was one of the first academic articles Robin penned it while she was a doctoral candidate at Northwestern University. Mark was in the game industry, still is, and so they collaborated on this to kind of give an academic analysis of what was happening, because games were starting to become more story-centric by that point. I just realized you guys probably are too young to remember this, but almost all games were driven by mechanics, and then Valve released Half-Life, and all of a sudden story was huge. And here we are in 2020, and story is just sort of natively huge. It's like, oh, well, of course games can tell stories. But that wasn't always a given. It wasn't always a known. It was usually like, well, here's a series of actions that we're going to ask you to perform, and you're going to earn points, and eventually you'll stop earning points. Or there'll be kind of a cartoony sort of a story, So there have been stories in games. If you go back to the original Super Mario Brothers, there's a story. Our princess is in another castle, but ultimately that other castle just exists to release more mechanics and obstacles for you to try to experiment with and get past and understand the dynamics. And so the experience ultimately is one of accomplishment because you've been able to unlock the puzzle that the designers have placed for you. Now, let's bring this back up to the Avengers game. The mechanics that they have is that the designers were like, well, let's use sort of role-playing game mechanics that players are going to be able to search for different things, which will give them upgrades. And so the dynamics are, we're going to have all of this different kind of loot out there, and then the players will figure out what they need to configure. And that will give them different benefits against different people. And that leads to some of the backlash in some of the early reviews from the game, because the aesthetic does not match what people think of when it comes to, in terms of the way a character like Hulk would be, what it would be like to portray or to embody that character. Hulk doesn't need to choose a different set of gloves in order to totally destroy all of the minions that he's facing. That is not what Hulk is. And in fact, that was one of the criticisms leveled in one of the articles that I read, that the aesthetic experience of being an Avenger is not that you have to choose the appropriate equipment. Now, maybe that makes sense for Tony Stark with upgrading his suit, maybe for Hawkeye with choosing different arrowheads, or possibly even different bow configurations. Might make sense for Black Widow with the different loadouts that she may have for completing a mission. But Hulk is pure id. It's rage. This is a guy that could potentially reach into the sun and tear off pieces and juggle parts of the sun. And they're saying that he has to choose a different set of gloves in order to be able to deal with low-level minions. And that is clearly not the aesthetic experience. So what Haneke and LeBlanc challenged designers to do was to actually reverse the arrows. So, whoops, I'm in move mode. You know what, can I just select all, copy, paste, yay. Well, that's not what I meant to do. It's kind of funky that happened. I'm just going to say that the aesthetics and dynamics and then mechanics, we need to just bring that this way. This tool is, I haven't used Miro before, but I've used a lot of other sort of brainstorming tools. So this is, it's a new approach for me in terms of this, and my trackpad's getting, a little wonky. Is there a way to make that even bigger? No, apparently not. Okay, well, let's kind of flip the script on them here. So the idea that Haneke and LeBlanc were working with is, let's start with the aesthetics. What do we want the players to experience? And then from that, consider what dynamics would make that possible. And then finally, what mechanics do we need to build in order for the players to have the experience that we are trying for them to have? Do you kind of see how, in my reading anyway, that Crystal Dynamics totally had that backwards? It's like, oh, we're just going to do RPG sorts of stuff. And it didn't lead to the appropriate aesthetic experience. Just brainstorming. I think that what would happen, if you followed any of the Marvel movies, we went from Hulk as Banner's uncontrolled id to eventually Smart Hulk. And, that's part of the arc that exists in different iterations of the comic world as well. So it might be that what would have been appropriate, depending on where they came into the story, maybe there was something that happened with Smart Hulk, and kind of in a Metroid sort of a way, that ability to control his rage was stripped from him. And so what Hulk is trying to do is to not be a pure damage machine. And that could lead to some very interesting gameplay. Now, I also want to say that would require a different set of dynamics and also a different set of mechanics, which would have led to increased cost and increased time. And it might not have worked, and you can't really have the Avengers without the Hulk in this iteration because of what's happened with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So what I'm suggesting is not a trivial change. It wasn't like, boom, they should be able to do that. It would have required a full team thinking about a completely different way to handle progression, and then how to hook that in with the other part of the game that already handles progression in a different way. So I totally get why they ended up where they did. I just don't think that they did a complete analysis of how people would read that. And I'm still hoping to play the game. I haven't purchased it yet, but I will be soon. But anyway, what I would like you to do is to take a game that you like. It doesn't have to be the MDA framework. You've also seen the Fullerton framework dealing with formal elements, dramatic elements, and systems. And you've also seen Shell's Elemental Tetrad dealing with technology, aesthetics. In this case, that would be the visuals and sense and smells and haptics and all of that. So technology, aesthetics, story, and mechanics, what we're asking the player to do. But take a game that you like and briefly, just say, well, if I look at that game not as someone who really enjoys it, but just kind of stripped out and take a step back, how can I look at that game kind of from a more of a design perspective? And then go ahead and post that to the discussion board, and this will contribute towards the final grade as indicated. Okay, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing what you write.